So welcome, folks, this afternoon to the Toadstool Bookshop online. I'm here today. I'm Katrina. I'm the events coordinator for the Toadstool Bookshop in Keene, Peterborough, and Nashua. And I'm here today with author and historian Ben Railton. He's going to present and discuss his new book, Of Thee I Sing, which is a history of patriotism in the United States, and kind of a look at patriotism in our history and in our current society too, I think. And I have this title available at all 3 bookstores. So if you'd like to come in and visit us, enjoy the sunny weather, take a yes, we'll have it at all 3 stores, and we have it online too at toadbook.com. And without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Ben. He is a very friendly and knowledgeable guy to speak with us here at the Toadstool.
All right, thank you so much, Katrina. And thanks to you all for being here. I really appreciate it. I know it is a beautiful Saturday afternoon or whatever time of day it is where you are. And I'm really glad to be able to spend a little bit of that day chatting with you and with anybody who's able to check out this recording down the road as well, about this book and about some of these histories and stories that I'm going to highlight. Thanks again to Toadstool, Katrina Willard, who's been my main initial contact at Toadstool Books. And I just wanted to say, I love these bookstores. I hope if you're in the area, you get a chance to visit them often, and certainly going forward. I got to give my first book talk for my prior book, We the People, at the Toadstool Bookstore in Peterborough, New Hampshire, in August 2019. And there's a part of me that is really sad not to be able to be in person to start this series of book talks for Of Thee I Sing. And I look forward to when we can be in spaces like that again together. But I'm also really excited to have the opportunity to do an event like this, a virtual book talk, and to be able to be in conversation with you all here and with future audiences who get a chance to see this as well. And on that note of conversation, the last thing I'll say before I share my screen and get started is, as folks know, hopefully, this is not the end of a conversation. This is just one piece of it. My last slide is my contact info. You can find it online pretty easily as well, my email, blog, that sort of thing. And please keep the conversation going. And if you see this down the road, please reach out as well to follow up with questions, thoughts, ideas, continued conversation of all kinds. I really welcome that. And I hope that we can keep that going well beyond this Saturday in March. So I'm going to share my screen and get into this conversation. And there should be some time for follow-up questions and thoughts and ideas at the end as well. All right, let me get this going as a slideshow. All right, so Katrina mentioned the title of the book. Because we're not in person and are not able to have it, I'm not able to have it in hand in the same way anyway. I wanted just to quickly show the cover there, beautiful cover. This is part of the series called American Ways from Rowman and Littlefield Press. And this is my second straight book with them, actually. I really love the press and I really love the series a lot, which is sort of overview histories of key American ideas and debates and topics. And this one obviously on patriotism, but I really love this series. I hope you're able to check out a lot of their work. They're all really great and they do a beautiful job, as you can see, with presenting these texts and these histories. All right, so to get started, even in a time of heightened and seemingly constant conflicts over core American questions of who we are, of what we're about, of where we're going. Even in that moment of ubiquitous conflict, January 2021, a couple months back, was a particularly conflicted moment, a particularly conflicted month. And at the heart of many of those defining political, cultural, historical, educational conflicts and debates in January 2021, we find concepts of patriots and patriotism, ideas, phrases, concepts of patriotism, playing important roles in those conflicts, in those different conflicted moments in January 2021. Or more exactly, what we find is particular definitions of patriotism, particular visions of patriotism. Because if you look at the 2 quotes that I've highlighted here, one from a Nation article which followed around a group of the participants in the January 6th insurrection in Washington, D.C., and then one from the 1776 Commission report, which was published by that group on Martin Luther King Day, or released on Martin Luther King Day in January 18th. If you look at these quotes and if you look at the way that they're presenting patriot and patriotism, I would argue that this is a particular definition, one that I'll come back to in a little bit and talk about at some length today, which is the version or the category of patriotism that I call mythic patriotism, a category that relies on a very particular definition of America, creates and contributes to a very specific vision of American identity and history and community, and that also defines anyone who critiques that vision, who disagrees with that vision, as unpatriotic, as outside of the concept of patriotism, even as un-American. And you can see that in both of these quotes. So the woman who's quoted in the Nation article refers to herself and her fellow participants as patriots and opposes that to a community like Black Lives Matter, a community of protest and critique of certain aspects of America as not patriotic, as opposed to that patriotic identity. And the 1776 Commission does the same thing. They define their own work as patriotic, restoring patriotic education, and contrast that very fully with critics, with teachers and scholars who criticize aspects of the United States and its history, which they call anti-Americanism, outright hatred for this country, not patriotic, but the opposite. So those are examples of a concept I'll come back to in a few, of the version of patriotism that I would define as mythic. On the other end of that spectrum, I would argue is not hatred of America or anti-Americanism, but instead is simply an alternative, a very different vision of what patriotism looks like, a vision that I define as critical patriotism. And I'll come back to that centrally today as well. And this debate, this contest between mythic patriotism and critical patriotism, with some other categories in play that I'll talk about, but centrally between these two visions. This contest, I argue, is not only present in our current debates and moments so fully, but has really been a defining one throughout the history, not only of patriotism in America, but the history of the United States. And in this project, I try to trace the history of the United States through that contested history of American patriotism. So in this brief talk today, I'm going to move through a few aspects of what I just highlighted. First, I'm going to very quickly define the four categories of patriotism that I trace in this project. In every chapter, in every historical moment that I write about, I try to write about all four briefly, to trace them as four different legacies and traditions of American patriotism. And I'll briefly note how coincidentally, but really powerfully, the four verses of the song America the Beautiful illustrate these four categories in each case, really succinctly and powerfully. And then I'll talk a little bit more about these two, I would say, central alternatives that I try to trace in this project, mythic and critical patriotism. In the case of mythic, by looking at one particular moment, the early 20th century moment, which embodies a number of different aspects of that mythic patriotism. And then in the case of critical, just briefly highlighting a few models of that alternative vision of American patriotism from across the 19th and 20th centuries into our own 21st century moment. These are all very brief glimpses into things that I'm able to go into at greater length in the book, but also, of course, we'll be happy to talk about more, whether at the end today or certainly in continued conversations, as I had mentioned, through email and other follow-ups. All right, so first thinking about these four categories that I try to lay out, because one of my main ideas in this book is that when we talk about patriotism, we don't have one concept in mind, even if we sometimes believe that we do. There are multiple possibilities. Now, the one that I think is perhaps most frequently what we mean or what we're implying when we call something patriotic is this first category, which I define as celebratory patriotism. And on these slides, I have quotes from particularly the intro of the book. I'm not going to read the whole of the quotes. If you want the slides down the road, just for example, please email me and let me know, and I'll be happy to send them. But basically, celebratory patriotism is the participation in rituals, in traditions, like the singing of the national anthem or 4th of July celebrations, or the reciting of the Pledge of Allegiance, the participation in rituals which express a kind of idealized vision of the nation and celebrate that vision, a collective expression of our celebration of this ideal nation or this idealized vision of the nation. And I think it's really important to be clear about something from the start here. I am not necessarily opposed in any way to this first category, to this idea of celebratory patriotism, because I think at its core, it is able to be inclusive. It is able to include all Americans, at least potentially, in these celebratory traditions and moments, which have some real value in creating a sense of community. Now, very often, I think this category bleeds over into the second, much more divisive and exclusionary category that I'll get to, but it doesn't have to. And I think it's important to say that there is a place, I believe, for celebratory patriotism in a community, in a nation, if it can be inclusive, if it can be truly shared in the way that it has the possibility to be. And so, as I mentioned, the 4 verses of the song America the Beautiful really interestingly line up with the 4 categories that I'm going to trace. America the Beautiful was written in 1893 by a Wellesley professor, Catherine Lee Bates, professor of English at Wellesley. She was taking a cross-country trip by train to Colorado, where she was going to teach in the summer of 1893. And in observing the nation and in stopping along the way at various places like the World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago, and then kind of in a culminating moment when she and a group of teachers hiked up Pikes Peak in Colorado and looked out on the vista that they saw there, she drafted the verses, this poem that became a song as well that we know as America the Beautiful. And the first verse really expresses a vision that I would call celebratory, a vision of the beauties, the idealized beauties of this nation, in a line like the purple mountain majesties above the fruited plain, particularly, of course, a word like majesties connoting some of that idealized identity, but also just the sort of beauties that that first verse really highlights, and that the title of the song, of course, suggests. And it's the first verse that is frequently the only one performed, which I think suggests in part how this celebratory patriotism can become the focus of our conversations. And again, I think it has real value. There is a value in seeing the beauty of a place that can be shared and can be celebrated. And that's this first category. However, even in that first verse, it's worth noting, like with the name Pikes Peak, that there are communities, particularly indigenous American communities, Native American communities, who are left out of that vision of the place. And that then starts to suggest this second category, the one that I've already begun talking about a little bit, that I call mythic patriotism. More fully, the full phrase I use in the intro is exclusionary mythic patriotism, and then I shorten it to just mythic for the rest of the book. And this is this narrative that I've started to talk about already, this vision of patriotism that defines a very particular America to be celebrated, an America that often, to be clear, has been white in very particular ways, very specifically defined by certain cultures and identities. And then the follow-up to that in this vision of mythic patriotism is, again, that anyone who does not share that celebration of that particular America is in this same narrative defined as outside of patriotism entirely, as unpatriotic, as un-American or anti-American even. So it's the creation of a very particular image of America, set of American ideas and histories and identities, the celebration of them, and the exclusion not only of others from those ideas, but the exclusion of those who don't take part in that celebration as well. And the second verse of America the Beautiful doesn't exclude those who don't celebrate, but it does feature a vision of American history, which I would have to call mythic patriotic. And that is its embrace of the Pilgrim community here in Massachusetts and New England as a kind of origin point for America, not just because of the fact that the song emphasizes only that community in that origin moment and point, rather than, again, for example, the many indigenous communities who were also in that place and moment, from the Wampanoag to many others, but also in the particular way that Bates writes about them in that second verse. And this is an example from the beginning. "Oh, beautiful for pilgrim feet, whose stern impassioned stress a thoroughfare for freedom beat across the wilderness." This image of that place as fundamentally kind of vacant, a wilderness without the arrival of that Pilgrim community and the presence of that Pilgrim community. That is, in brief, an example of a mythic patriotic narrative of the United States and of the origin points of America that leaves out at least as much as it includes. And so this second verse does embody briefly this more exclusionary category, this category of mythic patriotism that I highlight. And that category has been a really central one for much of our history, and too often has been what we mean when we talk about patriotism, is not simply celebrations, but the celebrations of particular visions of America that leave out as much and as many Americans as they include. But there are alternatives, and my third and fourth categories are both alternatives to not only celebratory, but especially to mythic patriotism. And both of these categories, I would argue, are alternatives for the reason that I highlight in the middle of this slide to start here, that on the one hand, or partly, they are active. They are active rather than passive. They're not simply about, say, participating in existing rituals or traditions. They require more, they ask more, they take more active, they allow for more active roles from Americans to be patriots. And they also do that in order to move the nation toward its ideals. They suggest in both cases of these third and fourth categories that America is not yet that celebratory ideal, but it can be, it could be, if these patriotic actions are undertaken. So the third category is what I call active patriotism, the idea that patriotism is expressed in service of, and perhaps especially sacrifice in one way or another for and toward these collective ideals. And the third verse of her song, of Catherine Bates's America the Beautiful, expresses a vision of that in her portrayal of Civil War soldiers, especially Union soldiers, of course, those who fought for not only the Union, but for the freedom of fellow Americans and the push toward that more ideal, inclusive America. And she calls them in that verse, heroes who proved in liberating strife, again, that strife for the freedom of others and of fellow Americans, that more than sense their country loved, that they loved the nation more than even they loved their own lives and their own identities. And that vision of their sacrifice, their service and their sacrifice, is an example of what I would call active patriotism. And I talk in my Civil War chapter about particularly certain Civil War soldiers, like United States colored troops soldiers, for example, as active patriots, but all those who serve and sacrifice, particularly in a cause like that, to try to push the nation forward. So that's a third category, and certainly one that is in contrast and even to some degree opposition to images like those in the mythic and celebratory patriotic narratives. But it's the fourth category that is my other main alternative, alongside mythic patriotism, but as this explicit contrast and challenge. And I'll come back to some examples of it in a few. And that is the category that I call critical patriotism. The idea that to be patriotic includes and perhaps even essentially means to challenge the nation's shortcomings and failures in an attempt, again, to move it closer toward its ideals, toward that idealized vision. And a parallel to this is the pretty famous quote from the historian Howard Zinn that dissent is the highest form of patriotism. But I think what I would add to that, the important corollary is, yes, even just the idea of dissenting, of the freedom and the possibility of dissenting. But I would say for this particular goal of moving us toward a more ideal, perfect union, that I think is an important part of the goal of critical patriotism. There's other reasons to critique, there can be other ways to critique, but critical patriotism, I believe, is the critique in service of pushing us forward. And in the fourth verse, if in a kind of implicit way, but I think a powerful way, Bates gets to a vision of that as well. She's partly inspired here by the World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago, that famous white city as it was called, but she's inspired to think about a future that is better than the present, pretty explicitly. And she, in that fourth verse, pays tribute to America, to a nation that is defined as the patriot dream that sees beyond the years, where cities gleam undimmed by human tears. And there's a potential religious connotation to that, but I think the phrase patriot dream is important. This is a dream of the nation, but it's a dream of a nation not yet realized. That's why it's a dream that is in the future still to be potentially realized. And certainly the human tears suggests her recognition that in the present, we're not there, that there are reasons for lament and sadness. And there certainly were many in the many divisions and destructions of the 1890s when she writes this, for example. So I think this fourth verse, briefly but importantly, envisions that idea of pushing the nation toward a more ideal future, that patriot dream that is at the heart of what I would call critical patriotism. So those are the four categories that I trace. And in the intro, I define them as I've briefly tried to do here. And then across 8 different time periods in my 8 chapters, I trace all 4: the legacies, the creations, the traditions, the voices, histories, texts, figures, and more that embody these 4 categories individually and in conversation and contrast with each other across these time periods up to the conclusion, which takes us to the 21st century. For today, I'm going to focus in more specifically than that. And first, for the third main category here, I'm going to talk briefly, but I hope illuminatingly about one case study in mythic patriotism, how it can be created, the many different layers to it, how it works, how that kind of exclusionary mythic patriotism affects the nation. And that is the early 20th century, which is my 5th chapter, chapter 5 in the book. Just a few different layers to that as a moment where we see many sides of mythic patriotism being created and applied to many different layers of American life in ways that I think really powerfully echo our own moment 100 years or so after. I've argued in many different spaces that this moment of the 19 teens and 20s is really deeply parallel to where we are. And I think this is an example of these many layers of the creation and deployment of this potent mythic patriotism. And an example of that, a really powerful example of that, is the Espionage and especially the Sedition Acts. And those two laws are usually connected from 1917 and 1918. But the Sedition Act, I would say in particular, really exemplifies this idea of exclusionary mythic patriotism and how it views any critique in particular. And as early as 1915, in his State of the Union address, President Woodrow Wilson was arguing for Congress for the need for these laws, for the need for laws like the Espionage and Sedition Act to define Americans that were disloyal, that were treasonous, that were not sufficiently patriotic in this very particular mythic patriotic vision. He notes in that speech, for example, that many of these in this xenophobic view of it are immigrant Americans who have been welcomed to the United States, but who have, quote, poured the poison of disloyalty into the very arteries of our national life. And he calls throughout that speech, and particularly in this long section, for a response to these disloyal, unpatriotic, treasonous voices and communities that he's arguing for: immigrant communities, activist ones, labor ones, a series of different ones, which we'll see in my later examples from this period. And Congress eventually agrees and passes the Espionage Act of 1917 and the Sedition Act of 1918. And the Sedition Act in particular defines precisely critique as treason, as illegal, making illegal, for example, as you see here, any disloyal, profane, scurrilous, or abusive, a series of adjectives that suggest a wide range, if not pretty much the whole range of possibilities of critique about even the form of government or the flag of the United States. Even that symbolic entity cannot be the subject of any such critique legally under the Sedition Act. And that law was used in a variety of cases to really strikingly attack not even just critics, although yes, but even unexpected voices and texts. And this is an example of that. A silent film, a silent movie from that early age of silent films called The Spirit of '76, which was about the Revolutionary War. It was produced by a Jewish American immigrant, a German Jewish American immigrant named Robert Goldstein. And this is a film about the revolution. So of course it depicts the English as the enemies. But in 1917, the United States and England were allies as England was beginning to fight in World War I and the US was moving in that direction. And under the Sedition Act, that producer, Goldstein, was arrested and accused of sedition for the way he had portrayed the British, why his film had portrayed the British. And he was convicted under the Sedition Act and sentenced to a decade in prison. And at his sentencing, the judge overseeing that trial, Benjamin Bledsoe, told him that he should count himself lucky that he didn't commit treason in a different country. You'd already be dead. So not only that it was justified to convict him for producing this film about the revolution, but that he was fortunate that this was the only penalty that he suffered. And so you can see the way in which this mythic patriotism, these kinds of visions of a very particular vision of American history and of anyone outside of it as unpatriotic and even treasonous, has very real effects. And I trace a number of them in the aftermath of the Espionage and Sedition Acts in this chapter. This is one particularly striking one. But this is far from the only layer to mythic patriotism in this period. Another layer, and it's connected to what Wilson was arguing for, but this is an even more extreme example of it, is the view that the labor movement was also not only outside of the celebrations of the United States, but fundamentally unpatriotic and un-American. And an expression of that view of the labor movement, of labor activism, was given by this Methodist bishop, William Quayle, who had become really well known during World War I and remained so after the war. And in February 1920, he gives a speech in Baltimore at a Methodist church there, where he argues that organized labor seriously threatens the existence of our Republican form of government. And he goes even further, claiming that labor's threat is a challenge against all that we have and are. And I would say not even just in government, he's arguing in the United States. And it is our duty as American citizens to challenge this. And if we don't, then this movement, these forces will banish political liberty from the land. And so this is a vision of this activist movement, these labor activists and unions and organizers and workers, as again, not only say not celebratory, but as fundamentally un-American through their critiques and their activism. And this narrative, among others, leads to a really prominent 1920s plan on the part of many American corporations and businesses that they call, very tellingly, the American Plan, which seeks to not only make it sort of impossible for unions to organize and strike and be activist, but to hire auxiliary kind of police forces to attack such activists. That's a core feature of the American Plan, is the use of militarized forces to attack these activists and these communities of labor. So you see, again, the effects of this kind of mythic patriotism very physically as well as rhetorically. Another layer to this is the anti-communist sentiments, which also build up out of the labor movement, the anti-labor activist ideas, but also develop into this larger narrative in the era that comes to be known as the Red Scare. And these fears as well define many American communities and activists as both associated with Soviet communism in the immediate aftermath of the rise of that new nation, and also as fundamentally un-American. And these are just a couple examples of many that become part of that Red Scare period and those images, those mythic patriotic images. In Seattle during a general strike, the mayor explicitly defines this as the battle between Americanism and these labor forces, these anarchists and activists. And that mayor, Ole Hansen, would go on to write a book called Americanism versus Bolshevism, which makes that same broader case. And then later that year, when the police in Boston are undertaking a prominent labor action, a prominent strike, President Woodrow Wilson again calls that action a crime against civilization, suggesting again this either or dichotomy between either being a part of that mythic patriotic vision or entirely opposed to everything that is American and civilized. And an Ohio State Journal editorial argued that those who participate should lose their citizenship. They should be stripped of citizenship and deported, which in fact does happen. It's happened throughout American history, but it happens with particular prominence in this period. And I cite a book in my first line here that traces that. It's a book called Threat of Dissent by Julia Rose Crowd, and it talks about ideological deportation, and particularly a lot focused on this period and the way in which those who were seen again as outside of this particular vision of patriotic and American were often deported, lost their citizenship, and so on. But this also then leads to particular visions of immigrant communities as likewise un-American, not just outside of this vision of patriotism, but as un-American. And we see that, for example, in a speech given on the Senate floor by a South Carolina senator arguing for the 1924 Quota Act, arguing that the point of this measure is the time that has arrived that we should shut the door, but most relevantly from my point, that defining America as one very particular identity. We have in America the largest percentage of pure, unadulterated Anglo-Saxon stock, and it is for the preservation of that stock that has characterized us. This definition of a very particular we, a very particular American identity, and this goal of excluding, literally excluding in terms of new arrivals, but also excluding rhetorically, ideologically, any who are not part of that community. And he links that very fully to aspects of American government and identity, as you see in the second quote, the genius of our government, the opportunities, the Constitution, all connected to that particular vision of American identity and that desire to exclude any who are not part of it. Another layer to these mythic patriotic narratives in the 19-teens and 20s. And then the way that the period, the way that the government and many forces in America treat dissent during this period reflects, again, the power of what that mythic patriotic view can do or mean for those who critique or dissent from it and from other aspects of a purely celebratory narrative of a very particular America. We see that, for example, in the racial terrorism of the so-called Red Summer of 1919, which actually was a series of massacres and lynchings throughout the year, not just the summer. Many of those events began with specific targeting of African-American veterans, those who had taken part in World War I, but who also reflected a critical lens on things like segregation and racial hierarchy in America as they came back to the United States and expressed and participated in that perspective. Much of that racial terrorism targeted that community very specifically. And A very similar kind of brutality was directed at suffrage activists, particularly the group who were known as the Silent Sentinels, who took part in an extended suffrage action in Washington, D.C. They were targeted repeatedly by official violence, including most especially in this night in November 1917 called the Night of Terror, when a group of Silent Sentinel protesters had been arrested, were held at this brutal prison in Virginia, Occoquan Workhouse, and were beaten and tortured for the entire night. Just one moment in this larger campaign of suppression and violence against that community of dissent. But, and I'll talk more about critical patriots for a second in a second, but critical patriotic voices continued to challenge not only those brutal treatments and those exclusions and repressions, but to challenge the very limited vision of America that they were wedded to. And we see that, for example, when it comes to African-American veterans in the W.E.B. Du Bois editorial, Returning Soldiers, in his Crisis magazine, the NAACP's new magazine, which argues about those soldiers that we return from fighting and we return fighting, to challenge those narratives, to resist, to offer an alternative. And so too, somebody like Alice Paul, one of those Silent Sentinels who was arrested and tortured and arrested repeatedly for her activisms, a government doctor said of her that she had a spirit like Joan of Arc, and it is useless to try to change it. She will die, but she will never give up. And so again, in the face of this kind of brutality, in the face of these mythic patriotic exclusions, any number of American voices and communities, figures, and activisms resisted and offered alternatives. And those alternatives then take me to my last category for these few minutes today, which is the alternative. That if each of our historical moments has featured examples of mythic patriotism, of exclusions, of very limited visions of American identity, and an exclusion of any who are not part either of that vision or of the celebration of it. We also, throughout our history, have models of this alternative, of this type of patriotism that, as I defined earlier, I call critical patriotism, critique of our nation's shortcomings and flaws and failures in an effort to push the nation toward a more perfect union, toward its ideals. So I'm just going to very briefly highlight a couple examples from across the centuries here, across multiple chapters in this project. Not going to go into any of these at length. They all deserve much fuller reading and attention in these brief seconds. In the 19th century, two voices in text that I always point to, and they are from my second and third chapters, respectively, my chapters on the early Republic and the Civil War period, are William Apess and Frederick Douglass. Apess, a Native American orator and writer and activist in the 1820s and 30s. Douglass, fugitive slave turned abolitionist and women's rights activists and continuing civil rights activist throughout the 19th century. And these are just individual texts that really highlight their critical patriotism. Apess's eulogy on King Philip, delivered in downtown Boston in 1836 at the Odeon Theater, and Douglass's What to the Slave is the 4th of July, delivered in his then hometown of Rochester, New York in 1852. And I'm not going to, again, read these quotes at length, but both of these speeches do both of the sides of critical patriotism, embody both of those sides, critiquing, passionately critiquing the exclusion of particular communities and the flaws and failures in American history and identity that go with them. Apess, more in terms of history, he looks back on the Wampanoag leader, King Philip, Metacomet, who in the 1600s represented a very different alternative identity in New England than did the English settlement there, and who thus became the namesake of the brutal war against the Wampanoag in the 1670s that came to be known as King Philip's War, but who Apess tries to redeem, and to redeem, as he puts it, in a way that every patriot will respect. Every patriot will respect the identity, the history, the inspiration that can be taken from a figure like Philip, who, as you see there, he compares directly to a revolutionary leader like George Washington. And so that's a historical vision, a vision of a Native American figure in history, and an attempt to offer it as a challenge to more exclusionary, mythic, patriotic kinds of histories. In Douglass's speech, What to the Slave is the 4th of July, he offers a critique of the present in a lot of ways, and even of the invitation of him to speak at a 4th of July celebration, arguing to his audience there that the 4th of July is yours, not mine. To drag a man in fetters into the grand illuminated temple of liberty, that mythic patriotic vision, were inhuman mockery and sacrilegious irony. So both of these speeches and men offer strident critiques of the exclusions, past and present, of a mythic patriotic vision of America, but they also come in their conclusions to the goal of moving the nation forward, collectively. And that's the other side of critical patriotism, is that desire to push the nation toward its ideals. And so this is Apess's concluding lines, that we don't have to simply answer for that past, that we can move toward something more collective, something more shared, something even more we, right? His use of we is really important in that moment. This is a collective vision of an American future that can be more ideal, more unified, more that perfect union than the history that he's traced. And Douglass does the same in his conclusion of his speech, that he does not despair, that he has hope, and he ends with hope, as he notes, and that hope is partly connected to American ideals, the Declaration, the principles it contains, the genius of America. But it's also vitally important that we can only fully move there through the critique, if we hear and respond to the critique that Douglass has offered. He makes that case, as does Apess, that critical patriotism is the link between the critique and the move forward toward the ideals. One is not possible without the other. And as we get into the 20th century, we see that even more explicitly stated in a couple of texts that I highlight here from among the many critical patriotic ones that I traced. These are from my 6th and 7th chapters, one on the Depression and World War II era, and then one on the 50s and 60s. The Langston Hughes poem, Let America Be America Again, one of my favorite American poems, echoes, somewhat uncomfortably perhaps, a very different recent phrase, but in a completely opposite way. Hughes is arguing that the mythological ideals of the nation, the dream it used to be, have never been inclusive. America never was America to me, the speaker says. There's never been equality for me, or freedom. But the poem moves toward that critical patriotic vision. Oh yes, America never was America to me, and yet I swear this oath, America will be. So again, the critique, but also the goal of moving toward that ideal together, inclusively. And even more succinctly put is James Baldwin's quote from the first essay, the title essay in his collection, Notes on a Native Son, his early essay collection. It's my favorite single quote about critical patriotism. It's the epigraph of the book as a result, where Baldwin, as he puts it, argues, I love America more than any other country in the world. And exactly for this reason, I insist on the right to criticize her perpetually. And the phrase that I would particularly highlight in that very succinct quote already is exactly for this reason. Critical patriotism is the inseparable linkage of the love and the critique. And the love is only ultimately defined if it includes that critique. It needs it in order to have its fullest expression and to move toward that idealized vision. And as we come to the 21st century, which is the conclusion of my book, I highlight a couple of examples of each of these four types of patriotism here in the 21st century. And these are two who I define as critical patriots. Colin Kaepernick, as you saw, is on the cover of the book. And the reason is that I think he really fully expresses that and very overtly expressed it, such as in this 2016 interview, shortly after he began his kneeling protest before NFL games for his 49ers team. He said to Yahoo Sports that, to me, he was talking about racial inequality and violence and other related histories and unfolding stories. This is something that has to change. And when there's significant change, and I feel like that flag represents what it's supposed to represent in this country, I'll stand. So again, the critique and the goal of moving forward as the express purpose of the activism and the protest, and the collective goal that he's trying to push toward. And then in a very different way, I would say the same about the testimony offered in early 2020 by Alexander Vindman, the National Security Committee, a National Security Council member who testified as part of the first impeachment trial in early 2020, and who told his life story and the story of his father's immigration from the Soviet Union and his family's to the United States through the lens of things like service and sacrifice, told the story of his own military service and public service through that lens, and made the case that his testimony in that trial, his criticism of that sitting president and his testimony in that moment was precisely an expression of that critical patriotism, of that vision of the nation, his father's vision, his own vision of that lifetime of service, proof of those ideals in action and of trying to move the nation closer to that through his participation and his whistleblowing before that in that moment. And I wanted to end quickly on that note of the 21st century, and I'll put up my contact info here for a couple before I end the sharing. I wanted to end quickly with just the last two quotes of the conclusion of the book, just to sort of bring us right up to this present moment, and then I'll unshare and we can see if folks have continued questions or thoughts of any kind. So this is where, having traced these histories of these different categories, this contested history of American patriotism across my 8 chapters and time periods, and having come up to this 21st century moment, these are the last 2 paragraphs about both our own moment and about these larger histories and ideas that I'm arguing for. So ultimately, I believe that, which I've just talked about, is one of the most consistent goals of all active and critical patriotic efforts, and has certainly been my goal in tracing them throughout these chapters. To make clear that American patriotism has always been a contested space, containing multiple forms and perspectives. There certainly remains a significant place for a celebratory patriotic perspective, for national narratives that highlight our ideals and the best of who we are. It's vital, however, to acknowledge and resist the ease with which national celebrations can turn into mythic patriotisms, often precisely by defining criticism of the nation as and even anti-American. Such exclusionary definitions of patriotism as of the nation itself don't just leave out other perspectives and communities. They assume consensus when in fact there is debate, making it that much more difficult for alternative voices and views to be heard and included in our conversations and society. We can't understand the age of Trump, the last few years, unless we trace the long history of those national narratives, of celebratory patriotism, and of how it can be transformed into mythic patriotism. That's why I've dedicated roughly 2/3 of each chapter of this project to tracing those most prominent, interconnected, yet ultimately quite distinct forms. And once we better understand those particular historical perspectives, we can likewise become more open to the inspiring stories I've featured in my chapter's final thirds and in the latter part of this talk today. Alternative, active, and critical forms of patriotism. Voices and communities working to engage with the gap between our ideals and realities and to push us toward a more perfect union. The legacies of those active and critical patriotisms likewise echo and extend into 2021 America, a moment when such patriotisms are more necessary and more crucial than ever. So with that, I will end my share and say that I remain, again, very open to continued thoughts, questions, ideas, follow-ups of any kind right now, and hopefully beyond right now as well. Hopefully you saw that contact info and you can find it very easily beyond today. And I look forward to continuing to hear from folks. But if people have any questions or thoughts of any kind right now, I'll be very happy to hear them.
I was going to say, if you'd like to use the chat feature, you may, but if you just want to unmute your microphone or turn on your camera, please feel free to do that as well. Yes, I think and this is just, even just from this presentation alone, you raise a lot of interesting points and draw a lot of parallels, I think, to contemporary American history, contemporary being in the last 5-10 years or so, you know, of my adult life, I guess. Especially you talk about how the suffrage activists, the silent sentinels, they were victims of state-sanctioned violence, of state-sanctioned militancy, and that was their form of patriotism. I think that this book is going to be extremely important, I think, for a lot of people to understand, you know, how we got where we are from where we've been. I was just really struck that too. And, you know, we talk about the history of the United States from a very white Western perspective. You mentioned King Philip. I didn't know who he was until after I graduated from college, and I've lived in New England my entire life. And it's a narrative, it's a pre-American, not really, but it is narrative that we are often not exposed to, depending on lots of things. But a lot of my friends from across the country have if I mentioned King Philip's War, they would have no recollection, absolutely no recognition of it. But you know, William Apess talks about him as though he is the patriot to remember and the patriot to look back on. Just really interesting too how narratives change and have changed in the last 150 years or so. It kind of blew my mind right there.
I appreciate it. Thank you, Katrina. And yeah, I mean, I think part of what's so important about, say, what Apess is arguing there, and it's a way, I think, just to connect it to another current debate, it's a way to intervene a little in the idea that our only options are like, you know, statues of very specific Americans, largely say founding fathers or the like, or nothing somehow, right? That it's either going to be those statues or we just tear them down and it's a void. I think the more crucial point, the one Apess would make certainly would be, why don't we raise statues to many, many other figures and make them central to our communities, right? And in central and western Massachusetts, what would it mean to celebrate somebody like Philip and the Wampanoag, again, as part of an American history, not as, you know, an enemy, which is what the war name kind of suggests. And that takes multiple steps, right? It takes saying America is not simply equated with the Pilgrims. New England is not simply equated. Massachusetts is not equated. It includes these indigenous communities as well. And then it includes histories that can be celebrated, right? So it's a version of celebratory patriotism, but it's a version that says we need to fundamentally challenge what and who we celebrate, or at the very least expand it significantly. And I think, you know, that's just such a different lens from the idea that it's simply a matter of sort of tearing down what has been celebrated. I think there's a need to critique, but the even more important need is to add what we can celebrate together. And that's why, you know, Apess says, you know, every patriot can celebrate somebody like Philip, right? And he believes that, and so do I, right? There are so many figures and histories and communities and stories that we all could celebrate if we better remembered them and included them and talked about them and so on. So I think that's a really important part of that reframing for me.
Well said.
Thanks, Katrina. Jeff, did you have a question?
Yes, Ben, thank you. And it's nice to see you.
You too.
Again, my general question is, where does we as a people kind of go from here? You know, I think when I read Zinn's We the People, my first thought was, my God, I didn't know any of this stuff. You know, I spent 35 years in a school system outside of Boston, where it's a grand old flag and the Thanksgiving stuff and the Pledge of Allegiance. It just gets, you know, reified and just, you know, kids get brainwashed largely. And how does individually, collectively, we can go about, you know, trying to shift or change any of what kids are taught and are just come to believe as the absolute truth, and say anything that's opposed to that is un-American, unpatriotic, communist, blah blah blah.
Yeah, no, I mean, and that, thank you, Jeff. That is, you know, one of the $1 million questions right now is how we move forward, and it's part of why I guess a big goal of mine across really all my last few projects and going forward, and certainly this book too, is to trace all of these different histories as part of what has brought us here, right? That it's not simply, you know, the worst version of us, for example. It's not simply the most exclusionary histories, although I do try to trace those here, but we have models of alternatives throughout our history. We have models of the best. And again, those models are not about destroying as much as they're about reframing and adding and imagining something different, imagining alternatives. We have so many models for that have, you know, struggled so fully for centuries, often in, you know, brutal circumstances and often partially or even at times unsuccessfully, of course, against the powerful forces and narratives too. But we have so many models of those voices and those communities and those critical patriotic and active patriotic stories in this project, for example. And so again, by tracing them, I think that is part of it, is to say, there's a legacy here that we can move forward with. And then the follow-up point that's so important, just like we were saying about Apess a second ago, is that legacy can be all of ours, right? That it's not a matter of simply saying, you know, that only belongs, let's say, to those who are part of a more critical community right now or a particular perspective right now. Part of my goal anyway is saying, what would it look like if we genuinely think about that critical patriotic legacy as something we all can carry forward? And obviously there are going to be limits to that. If somebody is, you know, fundamentally a white supremacist and who, you know, no one can be American who doesn't, you know, have a certain skin color, it's going to be difficult for them to ever see the legacy of all these figures and stories and histories as their own. And that's a stumbling block right now for sure. But I have to believe, and I do believe, that the majority of us, a sizable percentage of Americans, can see these legacies as part of us, as part of all of us. That it's not simply about, again, one category or another. It's about a collective history that can be reframed and taught and made a part of our educational systems and our collective conversations, and again, our statues, our narratives, our vision of who we are. And so that's, I mean, if and when I try to find optimism in this moment, and I do try to find it all the time, so not if, but when I look for optimism, one of the ways I try to do it is to think about just how many histories and stories there are that we can all embrace and celebrate. I really believe that. And it takes that reframing collectively, again, in all those different kinds of spaces to do that. And again, that doesn't mean it's all sunny or that there aren't going to be things that are really difficult and painful as well, of course. But I do think that's a big part of why I try to come back around to this idea of critical patriotism, of the vision of that it can be a move forward rather than simply a critique. While I try to hear voices, let's say, that are more purely critical, I think that's important. I come back personally to the two parts of that, the critique and the goal of moving forward collectively. Because again, I think without that, it's impossible to know how we could move forward in any kind of inclusive way. And so that to me is the real key, is better remembering, again, this legacy that's been with us all along, celebrating it, including it, and then thinking about how we can keep that work going, that work of moving us forward collectively toward the better version of us with those models in mind. That's a lot, but that's how I try to think about it.
Thanks, appreciate it.
Folks, if anybody else has any more thoughts, questions, or even just has a comment about the presentation you saw or about the content of the book, please feel free. Again, this is available toadbooks.com or at all 3 bookstores. We're going to have copies in Keene and in Peterborough and in Nashua, and we would love to see you in store. It's nice out. Go for a walk. Come visit while you're on your walk. It'll be great. Ben, do you have any final thoughts about the one thing you really hope everybody takes away from this book? Is it that we have this collective history that we can celebrate, and that there's more that we have in common than is divisive about our shared history?
Yeah, that's well said. Yeah, and I guess the other thing I would say about this project is that something like patriotism has to be able to be reclaimed beyond, again, the way that it is often used. Because I think for a lot of folks who are perhaps more, who want more to push beyond some of the kind of very limited exclusionary narratives of America, it feels like patriotism just is equated with that side. That to be patriotic, to be part of that concept is to be that purely celebratory mythic vision. In which case, if we're not that, then we're not patriotic. We're arguing for something different. And I guess part of my goal here is to say that's never been the only way to define it. Not in America anyway. There have always been these alternatives, these different possibilities for what it means to be patriotic and thus to be American. And again, I think if we can redefine in that way, can reframe in that way, it opens up the possibility for all of us, at least a lot of us, to participate in that project going forward in a way that is inclusive, that is clear-eyed, that is critical, that is not mythic or exclusionary, but is also ultimately still patriotic. I think that's a huge hope of mine, and I hope by tracing these, I can contribute to that project at least a little bit.
I think that's really admirable, and I'm so looking forward to getting this book in people's hands. Thank you so much.
Yeah, I can't wait to hear people's continued thoughts. Please, again, keep the conversation going beyond this time as well. And if you get to see this recording down the road, you know what to do. Reach out, please.
Thank you all so much for being here this afternoon. Ben, thank you again for coming to Toadstool once more. We look forward to when we can have you in store again. Please come see us soon.
I will for sure. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you all. Have a great afternoon. Enjoy the sunshine.
Thanks,
Thank
Ben.
you.
Toadstool.
Thank you.